his vision refocused on Hoplite. "Believe me or not, Golem, it is the truth I speak." Hoplite didn't reply, but there was still an air of danger about the Outworlder. One wrong move and he'd try and destroy Hom. Twindle was certain. The orc rubbed at his face, clearing away some grime before again he sighed. "Before I continue my quest, I would like to give you some forewarning about what lay within the Fiendwood," he said, his yellow eyes seeming to take in all those present. Hoplite seemed to perk up at this, the air of danger still present, but mitigated, affirmative. "It would be nice." Twindle nodded. "Aside from what our guide knows, we are ignorant of the greater dangers within." Her brows knit together as she thought of Theopalu. Where had he been when they were fighting for their lives? Had he run away? It didn't seem like him to abandon them outright. It was more likely that the elf had simply been asleep in the wagon. Knowing Theopalu, the sounds of combat likely didn't keep him from his slumber. The man could sleep through an earthquake, and that was no exaggeration. "Take what I say with a grain of salt," Hom said with an embarrassed shrug. "Much of my time spent wandering those wastes was during my insanity. I can only recall impressions at most, aside from what lay within the fiend city of Akanvar, which I had to pass through to reach the Fiendwood. Please, anything you can tell us will be of great use to us, even if it's just scant rememberings." Twindle said with a smile. Hom smiled back. "Stay clear of any trees you see, especially those with limp branches." "I vaguely remember something stripping the skin off around those," he said with a shudder. "The water is tainted. That was what cursed me once I ran out of my supplies. Preserved food can be found in the ruins of Akanvar, but it's hard to find and could also bear the curse. I do not know for sure." He continued, pausing to clear his throat. "Akanvar is a ruin infested with countless fiends, many of which are greater fiends. Tread carefully, and never stay in the open. Take back alleys even if it sends you on a longer route. Your goal should be to get out of the city as soon as possible. If any fiends see you, take them out before they can make noise, or you'll be doomed." "How large is this city?" Hoplite asked. "Are there any routes we can take to avoid it?" Hom shook his head. "Unfortunately not. I had looked for a long while, but unless you intend to swim ashore from the shot, it's impossible. Akanvar's high walls surround the other end of the bridge. Passage is impossible without passing through its gate, and thus through the city itself." He explained, his face grimacing. "As for the city itself, it is massive. I cannot give you an exact estimate, but I would have to say that it is about half the size of the Forwood, assuming it hasn't expanded in these past centuries." Lance goggled, mouth hanging slightly agape before she said, "The Forwood takes up at least a fourth of the Feylands. That is even larger than Akandar." "Indeed it is so," Hom replied, crossing his broad arms. "In terms of circumference, that is, there were no floating blocks in Akanvar. It is traditional in its construction. It is where the survivors of the 9th Godling War rebuilt after Ancharis ascended. Then it's also infested with the infected from that time period." Hoplite asked, "How many fiends do you estimate? And what are these greater fiends?" Hom bit his lip as he thought, eyes rolling up to the sky, before finally he replied, "To start, most of those poor wretches who were cursed at the beginning of Dekuma are hardly capable of moving. You'll see them twitching and moaning on the ground. But other than that, they won't be a threat. There will still be thousands, if not tens of thousands, within the walls that are still active. So again, tread carefully." He then sighed, pointing a thumb at himself before he continued. A greater fiend is someone who is about as dangerous as myself and Tolak. Dangerous foes, be warned. This information almost caused Twindle to shudder. An entire city infested with fiends about as strong as Halm and Tolak. Even if it was only 100 greater fiends, that was still too great a challenge for her party to face alone, at least not yet. Besides, it was possible that no conflict with these creatures would come to pass, assuming that they could find a safe way through. We have someone with us that was in the city before the curse had taken place, Twindle said. Hopefully, he'll know a safe passage through. Relatively safe, of course. I'm sure that there's no place in Akonvar that'll be totally void of danger. Ham's yellow eyes widened in surprise. Must be an elf, then. Don't know any other race that long lived. He'll be invaluable. He then turned his broad back to the party, facing the horizon and squaring his shoulders. But that is all I can truly remember. There isn't much time for you to finish your quest. You can only last as long as the supplies you brought with you. She didn't know for sure, but Hoplight's shoulders seemed to ease, ever so slightly as Halm said that. There was no doubt in her mind that the Outworlder agreed with the fiend. I have one more question, Hoplight said. Did you see any crashed escape shuttles, or any? He hesitated before saying, falling stars. He almost sounded strained, saying it that way. Halm then turned back to Hoplight, squinting before replying. Stars don't fall, Golem. I agree. Hoplight said curtly, answer the question. He sounded on the border of being irate. The formerly sturdy pillar of monotone straining beneath the great weight of his annoyance. She remembered back when they'd first met. He'd claimed that same exact thing, that stars couldn't fall, and that it was idiotic to think such. Looking back on it, it was a bit silly of everyone to think that, but it had truly seemed that it had been the case at the time. Well, I did see dozens of comets falling a while ago. I didn't put much thought into them at the time. But they did seem to come crashing down into the Fiendwood. Strange times we live in. Anyway, it is time that I be off. With that, he turned his broad back, bracing himself to run. Twindle started slowly. That's the wrong way. If you want to go to the Fiendwood, it's back that way. She finished, pointing in the opposite direction with her thumb. Halm's back then shot straight up, and he about faced back toward the party, a deep frown on his face. I knew that. He shouted. I was just testing the young tongue here to see if he would speak up about it. Twindle could swear that there was an intense shade of red shining through the purple on his cheeks, but surely that could not be the case. Kidka then placed a hand to his forehead, bowing before muttering apologies. Speak up, boy, Halm shouted. I wasn't paying attention, sir. Please, forgive my lack of perception, Kidka shouted back. Twindle frowned at the towering orc, unimpressed with his excuse. Kidka had to be the most perceptive man in the party. It was just a simple mistake. It wasn't something to try and cover up with claims of some asinine test. Perhaps he simply didn't want their perception of him to change, or maybe just Kidka's perception. He was the first tongue Halm had seen in centuries, so it was likely that he wanted to seem impressive. Especially after saying that he was next in line to be the mouth of Zod. She wasn't quite sure what that entailed, but it sounded like a position of high status amongst the tongues. She'd ask her friend about it later, when they were all settled in for the night. Well, just remember that next time we meet, I may test you again, young one, Halm said with a light huff. All right, now I'm off. I will clear the bridge for you all. I will see you on the other side. And you, elf, Halm paused, staring directly at Twindle. Thank you again for bringing me back from madness. I'll not forget it. It. Athena's tranquility touches all who need it. Good luck, Ham. Twindle replied. Ham smiled. Farewell. With that, he took his leave, running down the bridge toward the decapitated Tolak. They all watched as Ham grappled the headless body, tearing the arms clean off the torso before throwing them aside, the whipping chains bouncing off his steel body without leaving even a dent in his skin. As the arms landed on the stone, they slowed, seeming to become lethargic as they were detached from their master. They were quite powerful magical weapons. Surely there was one among them that could make use of them. One spirit had to be compatible with the item before it could bind itself to them, so the only way to find out was to go and try to claim it. Now that things have calmed down, it seemed that this was a prime opportunity just for that. She looked away from Tolak's arms and waved at Ham's retreating back, hoping that she would see him again, despite their first meeting. She did not blame him for his actions. Suffering through hell for hundreds of years would drive anyone to madness. She was amazed that he'd managed to come back to near-perfect sanity after having his pains washed away. Such torture surely had to leave a mark on his psyche, but it didn't appear that it had, at least not outwardly. Such a strong will. She only hoped that she could stave away madness like Ham could. Chapter 13. The chains chosen Lance let out a relieved sigh as the mountainous figure of Ham retreated into the distance. Sane or not, she could not bring herself to feel safe around one of the accursed. Despite that, she found herself wishing that his journey would be relatively safe for him. Losing his mind, only to regain it before losing it again, sounded like a horrible fate. And despite her feelings, she could not say that Ham would deserve such a thing. He had been a hero on a quest to vanquish Kazan. A noble goal, to be sure, one that she hoped he'd succeed in. Ideally before her party encountered him, of course. Strange, she had been so young when he had apparently ventured into the Fiendwood, only in her 30s if his timeline was accurate. Was that when she began training as a watcher? It had been so long since then. It was hard to remember. Everyone seemed to think that an elf's mind was a steel trap, but that was far from the truth. At least it wasn't like that for Lance and most of her race. Turlin, though, he truly did have an unfading memory. Much to the Trinket clan's chagrin, she frowned at the fact that the council member had crossed her mind. Lance had enough to stress about at the moment. Thinking of Turlin certainly wasn't going to help her remain calm. Well, Elam said with a stretch and a sigh, that was a good exercise. Let's not try and repeat it in the future, yes? He asked no one in particular as he strode over toward the collapsed form of Tolak. What are you doing? Alistair asked, quickly following after him. You're not thinking about taking those, are you? Elam shrugged in response as the others fell in step behind him, Twindle quickly overtaking him before he could reach the fallen fiend. I know it's tempting, but two things first, Elam. I need to ensure that the chains won't somehow transfer the curse, and we need to figure out who the chains are compatible with, she explained, grabbing him by the shoulder, his graying shoulder. Elam quickly shrugged out of her grasp. Don't touch me, he snarled. He clutched at his discolored limb tightly, his red knuckles on his other hand, turning white with strain. Lance could almost swear that the gray arm had shifted beneath Twindle's hand, but she was unsure if that was a trick of the light or not. He certainly didn't appreciate it being touched that way, but Twindle seemed to not be aware of that fact, for her eyes widened in shock as she stared at her friend. His devilish horns, red skin, and snarling face truly made Elam appear the devil that many claimed Ifrits to be. "I'm sorry, Elam. I didn't mean," Twindle started. No, no. Elam cut her off. "Sorry for snapping at you. Just," he paused with a heavy sigh, "just don't touch my arm again." "What? Does it hurt?" Alistair asked in faux concern. "Well, quit being a pansy." He sneered. "Just ask her to heal it for you, and it won't be sore." "It isn't sore, you wretched fop," Elam said snidely. Just don't touch it, any of you." "Ugh," Alistair grimaced. "Wasn't planning on it." "Ugh," Elam mocked, pitching his voice high. "Wasn't pawning on it." Lance couldn't help herself from moving towards them, sparing a glance for Hoplite to see if he'd try and stop her. She didn't think that he would. And if he knew what was best for him, he'd keep his mouth shut, or she'd give him the rough side of her tongue. She'd almost done so earlier when he'd shouted at her to get away from harm. But she couldn't bring herself to do that when his order was sensible. He said nothing, simply looming over the collapsed bodies of the fiends like a statue as his helmet faced the horizon. Likely he was pondering whether or not Hom could be trustworthy. Not the worst way to utilize his intense paranoia, to be sure. A deep bitterness at his earlier comments still seethed within her, but she'd need to try and keep it in check. It was hard, though. What he had said cut deep. But what was worse was the realization that he'd been right to say it. It had made her furious at the time, but allowing her mind to become muddled that way during battle would have likely resulted in her death. Very mature. Alistair sneered, crossing his arms. "It wouldn't be fair to you to banter like an adult," Elam said, a slight grin beginning to replace his snarl, "considering your limited mental capacity." "I guess you're right," Alistair said flatly. "In that case, though, it would be fair, considering that you're about the same size as a child." Lance frowned, looking over to Elam, and seeing that, while shorter than she, he was by no means child-size. He was of a normal height, certainly, maybe a bit on the thinner side. He was smaller than Alistair, though, who stood a head above the Ifrit. "You admit, through your own words, that I'm right," Elam said, the snarl replaced with a smug smile. "Baby-brained oaf boy. Die." Alistair frowned and opened his mouth to retort, but a sharp, intent glance from Twindle made his words die in his mouth. The paladin shook her head and gave a sigh, taking note of Lance as she finally reached the group. Nolvi had been trailing right behind, keeping her eyes firmly on the ground at her feet. Hoplite and Michael still stood where they were previously, the Outworlders both conversing on how much ammunition remained in the wagon. "If you could both act your ages, please. We must focus on the matter at hand," Twindle said, placing her fists on hips as she glowered at them. "I understand that you both must be interested in that fiend's chains, but I need you all to wait a moment while I try to identify them. After all, what if it gives its wielder the curse?" She asked sharply. "We have to be careful. And remember, the item has to be compatible with whomever tries to wield it. In a way, the item has to choose you, not the other way around." "We know that," Alistair replied curtly. "But I don't believe the curse could possibly transfer through a magic item." "And with what are you basing this hunch?" Twindle asked. "Is that really a risk you'd like to take without first letting me ensure that it is safe?" Alistair remained silent a moment before he finally said, "Very well, go ahead and check. As for my hunch, I've seen members of my clan claim magical items from victims of other curses with no transfer. But you're right, no point in taking the risk. Twindo then nodded firmly, clearly satisfied. She then looked to Lance, who had been standing just slightly to the side of the group. Are you also wishing to try and claim those chains? Lance opened her mouth to deny any such intent. Anything that had been wielded by a fiend could surely not be anything but cursed. But as she remembered what Hoplite had said, her mouth clamped shut. Maybe with these she could actually be able to join him on the battlefield again. Just like when they'd first met back in the Fallwood. Strange.